but also, you know, I think people, it's because a friend of mine was on Facebook making a comment about 90s hackers based on like you know, stuff from the Matrix, you know, dressing in leather trench coats and being all trendy and stuff. But actually my experience with this, there were a lot of fat loners in their parents' basements. You know, when you see them get arrested and stuff, like there was a guy called Zyklon who was and I don't think he was an anti-Semite, I just think the name sounded cool. But he was in a group called Global Hell, which was the biggest hacking group in the world for a few years. When he got arrested, he was just like a 19-year-old white spotty fat kid, you know. And it was just, and he's you know, getting sent to federal prison.
Sounds just like me.
Well, I was certainly all three of those things. I was a lonely fat white kid when I was a 90s hacker too. And I stopped doing it when I got my first girlfriend. Literally true story. I was like, I don't really want to do this anymore. But yeah.
So I've also got a long time coming Did Jesus Exist series finally started. And per our conversation, I actually watched Reza Aslan before I came on.
Did a talk that was like an hour long where he was standing on some stage. There was actually a pretty good summary of that book. Was that the one you watched?
No, sorry, I went to get some fresh water. It doesn't really seem to be helping. The one I saw was an NPR, probably Fresh Air. Interview, and the first like 6 or 7 minutes is autobiographical, which I've heard before. I sort of skipped ahead to where he talks a bit more about the content of the book. But yeah, I have several points on which I disagree with him, but you know, I don't disagree with his idea of the historical Jesus or the way that he kind of presents the basic you know, sort of premises about what his life would have been.
Well, the really important thing about Zealot and his argument in it is that, and this, he doesn't put this forward very well in most interviews, except for that 1 hour thing where he's standing on that stage, whatever the hell that was. Mostly there's not enough time for nuance in those things, so he doesn't put across what I consider to be a really important point, which is that he acknowledges that there's really only 3 pieces of evidence supporting the existence of the historical Jesus. And beyond that, everything else is assumption in one way or another. And basically the point of his book is that it's an Occam's razor thing. He's trying to come up with the thesis that requires the least amount of assumptions. And so he's not saying it's definitely true. He's saying likely it might not be, but based on what we do know, this seems like the most logical and the argument that would pass muster with Occam's razor the best. So that is a very key thing. He's not actually saying it as a definite thing. He's not saying it, he's not putting it forward as a fact. He's putting it forward as the most likely theory. And
that's what historians do.
Yeah,
that's what Ehrman does as well. Ehrman would also say that what is the most probable, you know, explanation for this? Which one is the most likely?
Yeah.
Versus, you know, which is the most exotic and least likely and requires a whole lot of assumptions. Yeah. It's kind of the same premise. Historians don't establish truth, they generate facts. And those facts are subject to change based on new information, right? So dates can change.
It's not even history. It's certainly not historiography because there just isn't enough concrete facts. You know, I think if I remember correctly, the 3 that he mentions in the book are the fact that Jesus had brothers. That is written down somewhere. That there's a family and that one of them was Jesus and there was a brother called James and there's a couple others. That is something that was written down. His crucifixion was definitely written down, and there was one, I don't know what it was, but there was one other fact as well. And all you can infer about Jesus' life are based on those 3 things. And the crucifixion part is the most important part for his argument because he points out that that was a punishment reserved for the treason, basically, for anti-Roman activities. And, you know, they wouldn't punish someone for spreading a religion they didn't like with that particular punishment unless they were campaigning against the Roman Empire and having anti-Roman rhetoric, you know.
Well, if you want to get deep into this, because I think how Ehrman, or would, at least based on what I've read of Ehrman, like his counter to that would be that if you read the Gospel of Mark, and I don't know if I've read the Gospel of Mark, it's actually my favorite Gospel. It's very elegantly written in some ways. But in the Gospel of Mark, it talks about Jesus giving his apostles secret teachings. And he theorizes that when Judas went to the authorities, what he told them was not Jesus's location. They could have found that anyway. What Judas told the Jewish authorities was that in secret, Jesus was calling himself the Son of Man, and that he claimed that he was the Messiah that everybody was waiting for in this apocalyptic time. And that was when it moved into treason. So that would be from like an airman point of view, like looking at the Gospels, how that whole thing went down.
Two things about that. Firstly, Reza Aslan throws out the whole Bible. He doesn't reference it at all.
Yeah, well.
He says it's not a historical document. Trying to glean historical facts from that document is not a good idea, so he doesn't even try. He says if it's in the Bible, it was written, it was probably heavily edited after Jesus died, and all you can really, he does use it for one thing. He uses it as a major part of his theory that James was really the most important architect of the religion, not Jesus. I'm not going to get into that because it's a huge thing about the uprising and the Roman clampdown on it and all that stuff. But I would also add that there were a lot of other zealots, a lot of other Jewish people claiming to be the Messiah around the time of Jesus's life. I think Reza Aslan mentions like maybe there were up to 100 other ones, and most of them weren't.
Some of which are listed in the Bible that he's throwing out.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, he's not throwing. He's obviously read it. He's just saying he's not using it as a good, historical document. And I think that's, for someone who's data-led, that should be a good thing. It's not a historical document.
Right, but his degree is in like comparative religions. He's not an historian. And so
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there are training. One of the things I talked about in the first video was the historical criteria. I'm going to go on and do some more in the next one. But I think that there is a valid criticism to be said when religious people say, "Look, the Bible is a special text, and you can't criticize it because it comes from God." That's as equally invalid as a reason for not critically engaging in a text as saying this is a religious book, and so we can just throw it out because these people had a religious agenda. The fact is that the authors, when the author of Mark was writing Mark and Matthew and all of them, they didn't think they were writing a holy book. They were writing down accounts. So if they were writing down accounts, then I think that that's how we should look at them and not just say, oh, because some people later on collected them into a book and called them holy 3 centuries later. Yeah, that somehow invalidates the original information that's in there.
They took bits out, kept bits in, edited the bits that were in. There were translation changes dozens of times. It wasn't just, that's the thing though, is that it's reductionist description of what happened. They didn't just collect the texts and that's it. They put their own mark on it over time. And that's why, that doesn't happen with historical, you don't go back and like edit Herodotus or something like that. That's, that's not how it's supposed to work.
Right,
so
but that's why historians, that's why historians go back and try to find early fragments, and they look for variations, and they trace back the genealogy of manuscripts, which, the Gospels were written originally in Greek, but they preserve some Aramaic texts in there over time. And Ehrman has a whole book on the Orthodox corruption of Scripture, where he looks very specifically at the ways in which the Gospel writers would change a phrase to make it more compliant with later theology. For instance, there's a passage, I think it's in Luke, where Jesus gets lost at the temple. Mary and Joseph both think that he's with the other one, and they go back and he's like with the scribes, who's showing how smart he is. And Mary says, where have you been? Your father and I have been looking for you. And you have some texts within some lineages of the manuscript where that was changed to Joseph and I have been looking for you, because the father obviously then questions the idea of Jesus's divinity. So these things happened on the Orthodox side, and it also happened on people not on the Orthodox side. But to sort of throw out all of the manuscripts, because of some allegations, I think
I've misstated that though, because he's doing basically the same thing you are with your series is historical Jesus a real person. Obviously, you're not taking as read everything in the Bible, because the Bible says he was a real guy, right? So your central thesis contradicts the Bible itself, but that doesn't mean you can't use bits of the Bible as part of your argument. So that's what I'm saying about Aslan, is that he throws out the central premise of the Bible being that this had these teachings. He's saying actually probably he didn't have those teachings. He probably had a whole different type of teachings, and then that was posthumously changed by James into being this Roman-friendly, peace and love thy neighbor thing that probably Jesus was not actually about. So he's not throwing out the Bible in the way that I may have put across. He's just throwing out the central premise of the Bible as being probably fallacious and invalid. So he
I
does,
think
he
one of
does,
the
it's
things,
like, not like he never references the Bible. He's just saying that, look, the three historical facts, as far as you can call them facts, because they were written by Roman historians. Those are the things that are the most reliable, and that they're much more reliable than anything in the Bible. So he's just putting a lot less emphasis on the Bible as a trustworthy source of information. It's not like he never ever references it. He references it a ton.
right?
Yeah.
Well, one of the qualities of that it makes for a conclusion that's stronger is multiple attestations. And as I go through in the series, there are at least 6 or 7 different documents that are all independent attestations of Jesus,
Yeah.
that really have a similar a presentation of his message and who he was. And the idea of a James theory would require that somehow James would have been able to infiltrate all of these independent sources. It just seems to me not as likely as the idea that
No, it was
these
before. His stuff was before all that stuff was written. Most of it, anyway. It was
well, like Ignatius was writing in like
66 AD.
110.
When were the Gospels written? After 66 AD, right? Mostly.
Right, but what about Paul's writing and Q and the Gospel of Thomas?
Right. Yeah. Well, the Gospel of
I
Thomas.
mean, I don't want to get into the woods on this because I feel like this is a real Bible nerd conversation. We might be
Yeah, which I'm not. I read the Bible when I was a teenager, but I don't really care about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to debate, and I think these are good conversations to have, and these are the conversations I wish we were having about this issue, rather, like really engaging in what the evidence is and the criterion in the historical sense, and also really, I guess I like the idea of this, the Occam's razor, and that's what I'm trying to do in the series, is putting the onus on the theories, the theory to account for what we observe. And not attack the evidence, saying, okay, if there's a problem here, you have to demonstrate where the problem entered.
Yeah.
I, for instance, would love to hear what was the original Jesus myth. Condense it down to its fundamental points for me. What was it, and how did it change over time, and who changed it, and why?
What Aslan says is that Jesus myth was basically interchangeable with any of the other zealots. They were all basically the same. The only real way Jesus differed is that his teachings kept going. His movement, like most of the zealots, when they were killed or died in battle or whatever, most of them died in violent conflict. But the ones that, all the other ones except Jesus, when they died, their group disbanded and went their separate ways. With Jesus, they didn't. They actually stayed as a group. And that is the interesting part. That's why they're different. And Aslan says basically his theory is that it isn't because of how magnetic a personality Jesus was that even after he died, his followers stuck with him. It was because James took over, and James was the one who was really the magnetic personality who kept the group together and was a natural leader and whatnot.
But James also sent counter missionaries against Paul, which he describes in Galatians, saying that, before James, some were sent from James, everyone was eating like Gentiles, and then he came along and Peter was swayed over to them, and even Barnabas went over to James's side, and all the Jews went back to observing the law. So James's version of his preaching of the Jesus's message was, it seems from Paul's letters and that were contemporaneous, that James was what they called a Judaizer, that they thought that you had to be circumcised in order to attain the kingdom of God because you had to be under the law. So I don't see how that's compatible with the apocalyptic view that was first found in Paul and then echoed in all of the writings after that.
Well, basically, going by Aslan's theory, that James would have considered Paul to basically be a lunatic. A dangerous lunatic who was basically espousing end time stuff, which Jesus did too, and all the zealots did. That was a big theme of that era. It was saying that that it's all about to end, and Jesus was saying he's going to come back, and the end times was going to happen, within the lifetimes of his followers. And so, yeah, I think James was not, if you take Aslan's theory that most of what is written in the Bible is actually from James, all the love thy neighbor stuff, then you can basically infer from that Jesus was not focused on that, and he was just like most of the other zealots, and with the Messiah complex, with the end times cultist stuff, and that he was basically a generic zealot. He ended in a way that quite a number of the zealots ended, for the same reason, likely. So yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I guess I would have to see actual evidence of that influence and its impact. You know, I can't think of any of the writings that would reflect that I can think of. But I haven't read the book or listened to the talk. So
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he gives what I would describe as a medium amount of citations and references and stuff. I mean, having said that, I'm a big Chomsky fan, and the amount of citations and references that guy puts out kind of puts everyone else to shame. So maybe I'm being a bit too hard on Aslan. Maybe his citation and reference amount is a high amount. I don't know. Yeah, I'm used to people who just whose citation sections are like a third of the book, which it's absurd. Some of the amounts that Chomsky gives, it's ridiculous.
He's thorough as hell though, so good.
Oh, dude, yeah. Nobody is as thorough as Chomsky. He's getting on now, obviously, but in his prime, he was reading, according to him, 80 news sources a day.
Whew.
Yeah. And the reason he said for that, he talks about it in the documentary Manufacturing Consent, not the book, but the documentary about him that was made over the course of like 25 years or something. In that he talks about how the mainstream press is totally corrupt in America and you can't trust them. You've got to go to sources that are much, much smaller where you can get actual news. Like he mentioned specifically Christian church newsletters as being an unbiased source of random information. They'll actually report things that are going on around the world. Like they reported on East Timor when nobody else was in America because it was, against the narrative because Indonesia was a friend and stuff. Anyway, he says, so he hates that stuff, but you still have to read that stuff. You still have to read the New York Times, and you still have to read the, what do you call it? I can't remember half of the names of the American newspapers, but you got to read the Post, the Washington Post, and all of that stuff. Even if it's unreliable, you still have to know what you're dealing with. You have to know your enemy. And so he would read all that stuff. He would read all the mainstream ones. He would read all the little minor little things. This is just in the days of print. And so he basically would spend all of his time researching that when he wasn't doing, work for his actual linguistics courses at MIT and stuff, which, I mean, he wouldn't have probably had to do a lot of preparation for between classes because he revolutionized the field single-handedly. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he is definitely someone I immensely respect. And what's amazing about him is that even as a grumpy old man, he's still, pretty reasonable, mm-hmm. which is...
I wish I could be that way as a grumpy old.
Yeah, it's admirable. Yeah, most men or people in general, when they get to that age, they turn into, right-wingers, basically. You just want things to be like they were their whole life, and they don't understand all this newfangled stuff.
Yeah.
Chomsky wrote a book about Occupy. He was so into it.
Uh-huh. I wish I was that into anything.
Do you see yourself being a crazy liberal in your old age or a conservative, stuffy, things were better back in my day?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I hope I'm one of my goals is once I've retired and it doesn't count, I don't need it for my work anymore because I do have to make a living, but I do want to get arrested for civil disobedience on a cause at some point in my life. So
that'd be cool. Yeah.
I'll do that as a blue-haired old lady.
Yeah, it's disappointing because in my country, we've become really apathetic about that kind of political protest. We used to be known for it, like in the 80s. And before then, we were a marching country. We were doing constant protest marches and movements, really popular. But yeah, these days, it just doesn't fly anymore. Nobody cares anymore. It's really sad to see what's happened. I don't know if that's the case in the US too, with people becoming apathetic to political discourse, but it's definitely happened here. People just don't care. The amount of voting has just plummeted,
That is
depressing.
Apathy to me.
Yeah. It's like, they're all the same, just go away. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a crisis of democracy because a democracy does rely on an engaged electorate to oversee what its government's doing. Yeah. And what we have right now are people who are just entirely disengaged and, they're low information voters and they see one thing on the Clinton Foundation and then another thing on the Trump Foundation and they go, oh, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So it's an excuse to turn out. But it's, it's when people tune out that governments get away with stuff they shouldn't get away with.
Absolutely. And that's why the situation is how it is. It wasn't an accident. It was done on purpose, by the American propaganda machine. That is the most effective propaganda machine in the history of the world. The Edward Bernays PR machine is amazing, and like, you know, just in an objective sense is impressive, an impressive achievement, but it's fucking horrible at the same time because it's turned America into a low information electorate who vote against their own interests routinely.
We just get all our news from like we just get all our news from Donald Trump's Twitter now.
Yeah, 140 characters max. Yeah.
No, I think that there's, you know, we're in a unique point in time where there is a lot of information out there. And I think people who might not have previously been engaged are getting engaged, or at least paying attention to things because it affects them personally, or through another YouTube content creator or some other blog, they found something, an issue that they care about. So I think social media is changing that relationship, but because, of course, everyone is spread out. You know, if there's a chemical plant that's dumping chemicals into your local water supply, all the residents will have a stake in that. There's a localism there that makes it easier to do those kinds of protests. When you're spread out on social, you know, through your contacts or through social media, one, you get exposed to more things, but two, it's much harder to organize in that kind of environment, a digital environment.
Yeah, also because the news just comes so thick and fast. It has a different kind of apathy effect. So there's so much of it, you know. It's like, oh God, another water crisis, you know, another, you know, incident of toxic water supply. And that happens with all the, you know, another plant being closed in some place in America. It just gets overwhelming, you know, the amount of it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that completely.
It's tough as well because that propaganda machine that I referred to earlier, it does still exist in the internet era and is waging a war on you know, real information by funding all these right-wing channels. You know, like Angry Bastards did that video where he worked out who's funding a lot of the alt-right channels, and they often trace back to the same right-wing think tanks and to the GOP itself in some cases. You know, so they're finding ways to pollute the discourse with misinformation by funding people like Christina Hoff Sommers, Gad Saad, you know, who put out basically academic propaganda. They're academics, but they're putting out anti-academic propaganda through the guise of being themselves academics, although they're both considered basically a laughingstock by academia, especially CHS.
Yeah. It reminds me of the TV documentary that was on in the UK, The Power of Nightmares.
Yeah, oh, love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah, I love all that guy's stuff.
And the kind of critical media analysis, it was very, you know, it really showed me, it gave me a new way of like thinking about the media and the way that stories are constructed, not just a sort of like the bias but try to be objective, but this sort of oh dearism, being overwhelmed by the negativity and helplessness because you can't fix all the problems at once.
You know, Adam Curtis actually did a documentary called Oh Dear, which was specifically about that.
No, but I should look it up.
It was a short one. He does a series of I don't know if you know who this guy is, but there's a guy in the UK called Charlie Brooker, who does a lot of political social commentary stuff.
Charlie Brooker.
Adam Curtis, he commissioned Adam Curtis to do a series of short documentaries to be basically embedded in Charlie Brooker's work. And the Oh Dear one was one of those. It was about Rupert Murdoch and about how he has basically pushed that Oh Dear narrative.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The Edward Bernays thing I was referencing earlier, that actually was my original contact with that, even before I read Chomsky, was before I read Manufacturing Consent, was from a documentary that Adam Curtis did called what was that one called? The Century of the Self, which was all about how Edward Bernays used the theories of his uncle Sigmund Freud, combined that with modern theories of propaganda, and created the public relations industry, and about how that has had knock-on effects throughout the Western world. You can see that beginning with things like changing the name of the Department of War to the Department of Defense, you know, 1984-esque stuff, you know. Yeah.
The power of language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's really, he's a fascinating guy. And he actually, two of his documentaries were part of the reference material, since I haven't made it yet, but are part of the reference material for my Islamic terrorism series that I'm slowly working on. And that documentary, Power of Nightmares, and also another one he did last year called Bitter Lake. Which is in the same
I have a
vein.
video. Yeah, I have a video that I've been meaning to make for a long time. I just haven't found the time. And the working title is, Yes, Facts Are Socially Constructed. And I want to talk about the notions of ontology and epistemology in the social world and how science produces facts that impact us. It's going to be similar to the talk I'm going to give for Professor Mariorti's seminar in the autumn about scientists as knowledge producers, and then the knock-on effect that has on our perception of our realities. So yeah. But that video really needs to get made, because when people laugh at the idea that the facts are socially constructed, I'm like, you might as well laugh at the theory of evolution.
Well, exactly, because evolution was a concept that was around before the theory of evolution was codified. It was people had looked at apes and gone, hey, they look kind of like humans. Wonder if that's a thing, much before the Origin of Species was written. People knew about that. They just hadn't codified it into a proper theory. And so the idea that Darwin came along and discovered it for the first time is not accurate. And it really goes to describe the difference between a term and the theory around that term, or a concept and the theory built around that concept. And it's exactly the same with patriarchy. That's why the term patriarchy without theory on the end has a different meaning, because it's a symptom of the thing that patriarchy theory is about, not the whole thing, just part of it. And it's the same with germ theory. People knew sort of what germs were, but they didn't have a total understanding of it, and it was incomplete. And that's what scientific theories are. They come along and they take a pre-existing, I guess, problem, you'd call it, or thing, and sort of work it out and structure it into a nuanced argument that's, complete, or mostly complete at least,